not just on America, but on the rest of the world. And to discuss its impact on Germany and Europe as a whole, we have with us today Arthur Sullivan, the political correspondent from DW, all the way from Berlin, and he will provide us insights on the outcome of the 60th presidential elections in the US and how it will shape policy directions, security strategies, and economic ties. Arthur, welcome to the show.
Hi, Flora. It's really nice to join you today.
In 2020, when Joe Biden took to office, there was sort of a sigh of relief in Berlin. You know, Biden was seen as this good old-fashioned transatlanticist, and Trump, on the other hand, was a major source of instability and disruption. And I think somewhere Germany expects that Harris will ensure a sort of continuation of multilateralism. A day ahead of polling in the United States, what is Germany thinking, what is Germany expecting, and what is Germany hoping?
Well, I think you put it there very well yourself, Flora. I think when Biden was elected, there was a collective sigh of relief because the Trump presidency in the previous 4 years had been a period of such disruption to that sort of global order, which countries such as Germany and other major countries in the EU had been sort of used to and accustomed to. There was an expectation that transatlantic ties between the US and Europe would be pretty much ironclad, although there would obviously be disagreements from time to time. Largely the post-World War II order, which has shaped much of the Western world in that time, would be maintained. Trump came into power, it obviously was very, very different, and people saw the disruption that caused, and then Biden was indeed a return to that older style of transatlantic sort of leadership and openness to the transatlantic relationship from the US. On the cusp of this election, to answer your question, polling, first of all, would tell us that polling that has taken place within Germany, most German people want Harris to win. Somewhere between 2/3 and 80%, according to different polls, say that they would prefer to see Kamala Harris and the Democrats in power. In terms of the government, I think there's absolutely no question. I mean, they can't come out outwardly and say, well, we want Harris to win, but it's quite clear that they do. The government at the moment in Germany is actually very, very unpopular. There's even a chance that this government could fall quite soon. It's a three-party coalition. There's all sorts of domestic and economic problems here within Germany. But I've even heard it said in recent days that if Harris were to win, that would give the government, there'd be more likelihood, in fact, that they would actually fall earlier, because it would be seen as, well, at least that situation is stable, we can then deal with our own problems. If Trump were to win, it would be seen as such a potential crisis for Germany and for Europe in terms of security or financial or economic or otherwise, that the government would be more likely to actually stay in place, see out its term, because of the potential instability that a Trump election could bring. So I would say at this point in time, the majority of German people, certainly a comfortable majority in the German establishment, both the government and the opposition, want to see Harris return to the White House. In terms of what do they think will happen, well, I think like the rest of us, they don't know what's going to happen, because this is clearly a very difficult election to call. Polling obviously puts the candidates at 50-50, but there's so much complexity within that no one clearly knows what's going to happen until it actually happens. So no one really knows what's going to happen, but I think it's quite clear that here in Berlin and across Germany, the majority of people would like to see Harris in the White House.
Absolutely. We'll come back closer home, but before that, how do you think that this election outcome is going to have an impact or shape Germany's foreign policy and overall Europe's, especially given that, there are two wars going on, one in the Middle East and the other one, especially the one in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. How do you think that is going to shape the foreign policy, especially keeping Russia in mind?
Well, as I said at the outset, obviously Germany and the EU and the US have historically been aligned on most of these issues. Obviously, that does vary from time to time, but in terms of this current one, so if Trump were to win, obviously, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, Trump has repeatedly made it clear that he is not a staunch supporter of Ukraine in the same way that Joe Biden was, in the same way that Kamala Harris would be, and certainly in the same way that most of the established governments of Europe are. So Trump, for example, during the campaign trail, in fact in the debate when he was asked about Ukraine, he emphasized he just wants to get the war over quickly. Now what does that mean in practice? That means Ukraine would have to cede huge swathes of its territory to Russia. Roughly 20% of Ukraine has been occupied by Russia over the last 2 years, but going back as far as 10 years when you include Crimea. what would happen if Trump came to power? Would that all simply be gone away with to Russia in a deal? Obviously, that's something that Europe has to seriously look at. So if Trump were to win, it means they're going to have to double down on their support of Ukraine and fight tooth and nail to, affirm Ukraine's right to its own sovereignty and continue to supporting Ukraine. If Harris were to win, obviously, it would be a continuation of the Biden policy with regard to Ukraine, which is staunch support. The phrase that's been used a lot is as long as it takes, or, as long as is necessary. That's something that the German government and the French government and other leading EU governments emphasise, that they want their support of Ukraine to be seen as ironclad. So certainly a Trump victory will urgently complicate that situation. It will bring into question, in fact, support for Ukraine. And that's, Flora, we have to say that's at a time when Ukraine is under immense pressure in that war. The Ukraine front line is really struggling to reject and repel the Russian advances at this current time. There's constant wrangling over the type of military support that Europe is sending, and indeed the US, to Ukraine, and a Trump victory would just be a huge complication to that. So obviously that's the two kind of dynamics at play there. When it comes to the Middle East, it's a more complex picture. Germany is a staunch supporter of Israel. Both the US candidates and the mainstream US policy is also a staunch supporter of Israel. And so while there of course is calls for ceasefire, for Israel to mitigate some of its military activities, and there's calls for an easing of and a cessation in some cases of activities, broadly speaking, I think it's fair to say that when it comes to Germany, whichever candidate in America wins, there's probably going to be a broad alignment of policy on that issue. But of course the Middle East is an extremely complex place. There's a lot of different dynamics at play. For example, if Trump were to win, it's not necessarily clear. One of the things that's been, I guess, clear about Trump's policy with regard to foreign policy is that it's been inconsistent. It's unpredictable. No one quite knows what would happen. But I think the bottom line here, Flora, really is that Europe can, and Germany can obsess over who's going to win this election in the US. They can think, well, is this good for us? Is this bad for us? Will this affect us? Europe needs to watch out for itself as well, because what's become clear over the last few years, since the first Trump presidency, but also in the Biden administration, America is not always going to necessarily look upon Europe in the same way that it has done for decades. There's already a clear pivot, as there was during Obama's presidency, and also potentially a little bit under Biden's, and certainly under Kamala Harris's potentially, towards East Asia and towards the global south and other very areas of the world. So Europe needs to focus on itself as well, and not necessarily obsess too much on what happens in the US elections.
Absolutely. Apart from the foreign policy, both United States and Germany are a part of NATO, and NATO is a very crucial institution when it comes to geopolitics. Now, Harris has been a supporter of NATO, but at the same time, on multiple occasions, Trump has questioned the very purpose of NATO itself. What implications will be there in case there is a Republican nominee or a Democratic nominee on NATO and the transatlantic relations?
Well, Flora, I think this is the biggest question, and I deliberately didn't touch upon it yet because I knew that this deserves a question all on its own. This is the single biggest issue that I think European leaders are really worried about when it comes to the outcome of this election, because, of course, I already mentioned the Ukraine situation. That is directly tied up with what will happen with NATO. So if we go back to when Trump first was elected, the 2 or 3 years into his presidency in 2018, there was an infamous NATO summit in Brussels where Trump essentially left it out there to the leaders at that summit that he was going to pull the US out of NATO if other NATO countries did not up their spending and generally up their commitment to NATO. Now, you have to say, when you look back at that, Trump had a point, and he certainly had some success, because since that time, several European nations have significantly upped the amount that they spend on NATO. I mean, the commitment is you should spend around 2% of your GDP on your defence budget. So many European nations were not doing that. Now, around 23 of the 32 NATO members, which are the vast majority of those, are European countries. In fact, I think 30 of them. So much, much more of them now are doing that at least. So it has been effective in that sense from Trump's perspective. But Trump still he tends to view a lot of his foreign policy initiatives and relationships transactionally. So he will never necessarily just say, in the same way that a Democrat such as Harris or Biden will say, we will be a member and supporter of NATO no matter what. It's always, well, what do we get out of it? So that still is being held over this debate. For example, I mean, Trump did rein in the rhetoric on NATO during this campaign. He was, we're going to leave NATO if there's not more commitment. But you have to look at the bottom line of the figures here. The United States still accounts for roughly 2/3 of NATO's budget. And it's one country. The fact is, the the United States is NATO. Without the United States, there is no NATO. So that overhangs this whole discussion. And that's obviously the single biggest fear that a lot of European leaders would have, that if Trump returns, well then that big existential question around NATO, and then as a result, support for Ukraine comes into the picture. Harris is much more, of course, a continuation of classic transatlantic relations that Biden epitomised: staunch support for NATO, staunch support for Europe, and a constant reaffirmation of what is the most successful military alliance in history. NATO has been in place since World War II. It is an extremely strong military alliance in terms of long, multi-decade ironclad union between two very important parts of the world. And so that would very much be the Harris-Biden position. And that's the main reason, I think, above all others, why European leaders, and especially here in Germany, they do not want to have to take on the leadership role that the United States has taken on, even though some would argue they should. They want the United States to be there, have its full backing for NATO, not just for Ukraine, but indeed for Europe's own security at a time when Russia is probably more dangerous to Europe than it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely. We all know that geopolitics is an important part of international relations, but so is geoeconomics, as in governments will be formed, governments will topple, but at the same time it's the trade, the global supply chain that always has to maintain some sort of balance. Now US is one of the most important trading partners of Germany, and every economic policy decision in Washington DC has a direct impact on Berlin. In one of his campaigns, Trump said that if elected, he would impose a 60% US tariff, 60% tariff on US imports to China and 20% on the rest of the world. And I'm sure this will have a direct ramification on automobile and pharmaceutical industries in Germany. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, one of the really interesting things, Flora, about Trump is that of all other topics, I think there's no topic closer to his heart and also probably closer to his genuine view than the way he talks about trade. If you look at old clips of Trump, going back to the 80s, he was a much milder sort of personality on camera. He wasn't necessarily the bombastic presence we see today. But when he spoke about trade, now at that time his focus was on Japan rather than China, but when he spoke about trade, he got animated, he got passionate, and he got angry. So he has a firm belief that the United States should not be buying more from other countries than it's selling to them. He fundamentally believes that. Now, economists will obviously take issue with that from various perspectives. There's all sorts of reasons why it doesn't have to be one way or the other. But Trump fundamentally believes that America should not be buying more than it sells if it's not getting a good deal. So if Trump comes to the White House, he's already made it quite clear, if he returns to the White House, that he would be putting something in the range of 60% tariffs on China and 20% tariffs on all other countries. Now, most mainstream economists have said this would not be good. This could lead to serious inflationary issues. It could create great complications even within the domestic American economy. But obviously, from the perspective of companies in every country in the world, every major economy, including in India, but of course here in Germany as well and across Europe, if you're a car maker, if you're a manufacturer, if you're a company or an industry that is traditionally used to selling your wares in Germany, well then 20% tariffs on a range of those goods is very, very bad news. Now, Trump, often his bark is bigger than his bite. He doesn't necessarily follow through with a lot of these things, and he especially doesn't always follow through with them when it comes to Europe. I think deep down he understands that he can't necessarily alienate Europe in the same way he may wish to alienate a country like China because of political and cultural ties between the US and Europe. So it's not necessarily going to follow through that Trump will do this. I think we can safely say, though, that like with how Trump influenced the direction of NATO with his sort of, threatening remarks to leave it, Trump has also had a profound effect on global trade and on the issue of tariffs. Since Trump brought in the tariffs against China and other countries in his first term, those tariffs have largely been maintained by the Biden administration. I think Harris, in fact, would likely maintain them. Now, she's not going to necessarily level a lot of new ones, but she may well increase the generally, skeptical stance of the US towards countries like China when it comes to trade. And indeed, globally, Flora, we have seen all across the world tariff barriers are rising against China from countries such as India and many others. And I mean, it's a complicated picture depending on the different bilateral relationship. But we are seeing an age of restrictions to global trade. Much of it has been ushered in by Donald Trump. Now, of course, if he does return to the White House, it's probably going to ratchet up significantly. But we don't know really until he's in power what he's actually going to do. But of course, from the industry's perspective in a country like Germany, they do not want that fear, that uncertainty, that disruption that Trump tariffs and new tariffs would potentially bring.
Right, Arthur, before we move on to the topics such as climate change, we'll take a look at 5 key issues that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have been battling it out on the election campaign trail. Let's take a look at the Express report.
As the race for the White House intensifies, candidates Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are focusing on 5 critical issues that could shape the future of America. In this video, we break down each candidate's stance on these critical topics and explore how their visions could shape America's future for the next 4 years. Trump is touting his tax cuts for businesses, aiming to impose tariffs over 10% on all imports to reduce taxes for American families. He envisions making the US the crypto capital of the planet with his newly launched cryptocurrency platform. In contrast, Harris is reaching out to the middle class with her Opportunity Economy plan, which includes moderate tax hikes for the wealthiest and incentives like child tax credits and support for first-time homebuyers. Trump's immigration policy is stark, vowing mass deportations of undocumented migrants if re-elected. He has previously categorized immigrants as detrimental to the country. Harris, while also advocating for stricter immigration measures, supports investing in border security to manage the influx of migrants. Reproductive rights remain a pivotal issue post-Roe v. Wade. Trump, who credits himself for appointing the justices who overturned this landmark decision, suggests further restrictions on abortion medication. Meanwhile, Harris is committed to reinstating nationwide abortion rights, highlighting the issue as a cornerstone of her campaign. On November 5th, voters in 10 states will consider amendments that could significantly impact abortion access. With ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, Trump has promised swift resolutions without detailing his strategies. He criticizes U.S. financial aid to Ukraine, while Harris pledges unwavering support for Ukraine and emphasizes humanitarian concerns in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Climate change remains an unresolved topic, with neither candidate offering comprehensive plans. Trump dismisses climate concerns as a hoax, advocating for increased oil drilling and cutting renewable energy subsidies. Meanwhile, Harris champions the Inflation Reduction Act, aimed at boosting green energy investment and reinforcing the US's commitment to international climate leadership. As both candidates make their final pushes ahead of the election, these 5 issues will undoubtedly play a crucial role in shaping the political landscape.
Welcome back, viewers. Moving on, the Federal Minister of Finance in Germany, Christian Lindner, has said that the US and EU trade war could have only losers. He said that they are poised at the forefront of a new era of transatlantic relations. Let's take a look at what Lindner had to say.
A very important player in the German financial market. We are following the domestic debate in the US, and of course we know that some are considering tariffs. A trade controversy between the US and the European Union would not see any winner but only losers, and so whoever will enter the White House, we are in the forefront of a new era of transatlantic diplomacy. to convince our US partners that we need more or less a new trade agreement between US and European Union instead of introducing tariffs. We will keep an industrial heart. We have introduced already some measures, but we need further ambition because the situation of the German economy is not satisfying, to say the least. And this is why we have to start a process and at its end should be part of a new agenda 2030, an holistic approach to more competitiveness in Germany. Plays important. The Commerzbank is a very important player in the German financial market. It plays an important role, especially for our Mittelstand. But the German banking system is not only stable, it is diverse. Talking about Commerzbank, I want to emphasize that the Bundesregierung is convinced of the strategy of independence of Commerzbank, and this is why we will sell our shares in the long term, but at the moment we have no plans to further sell. For example of the United Kingdom.
Arthur, Harris sees climate change as an existential threat. But if Trump wins, then US will turn away from climate action and withdraw from climate agreements as well. But Germany, the German government is very particular about climate protection. So how do you think that the outcome of the US elections will have an impact on Germany and European Union's climate policies?
Well, I think this issue is probably, a close second to the NATO issue when it comes to importance for Europe, and yet, strikingly, we've barely heard climate change mentioned on the campaign trail in the US, only fleetingly, I would say. So, of course, you said it absolutely correctly. I mean, Trump is a climate change skeptic. He's
aber diese Verzögerung, die ist aber ziemlich normal.
He made some comments.
Wir sehen ja im Prinzip, du musst dir die Schleife vorstellen, dieses Bild
that it used to be called global warming, that they had to change the name to climate change because the planet wasn't warming anymore. Again, pouring doubt over the very concept. So that just shows you the extent to which Donald Trump is clearly a disastrous president when it comes to dealing with this clearly, undeniably existential issue for the planet, which mainstream science has all agreed upon. And there's endless examples of proof that we could give which show that climate change is a real issue. So that needs to be called out very simply, and it is called out consistently by politicians such as Harris. If Trump was to come to power, of course, we're going to see a ramping up. I mean, he uses the term drill, baby drill in the US. He clearly is going to, continue fracking, shale oil drilling to a massive extent. It's not something he's going to in any way prioritize. Your reporting there mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which was brought in by Biden. Huge green investment program, hundreds of billions of dollars pledged to green investment, and it's already having a major impact in the United States for jobs. There's talk, indeed, from Republicans and Trump that some of those subsidies would be cut in favour of fossil fuel industries, which again seems like madness at this stage. And then, of course, there's the big thing of international agreement when it comes to climate change, because dealing with climate change has to be done collectively and multilaterally. And it's a very complicated thing to deal with, because you're not talking about comparable countries. You've developing economies, sometimes at a very different stage of economic development, who shouldn't necessarily have to bear the same burden as developed economies when it comes to the extent to which they're lowering and reducing emissions. So you need to have these multilateral agreements in place where there is broad agreement. If a country like the United States, as it did previously by pulling out of the Paris Agreement, if it was return to that kind of a position and pull out again of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and potentially reduce its involvement in other climate change agreements, well, then that's obviously a disastrous result for countries like Germany and others who are trying to convince other countries to reduce emissions and to try and deal with this issue. A Harris victory would of course be much better for those who want to see this issue tackled. She makes it very clear where she stands on the issue. She is a full supporter of the Inflation Reduction Act and the kind of policies that tries to bring in. She would like Biden did. Biden brought America back into the Paris Agreement. She would, of course, uphold that position and would broadly be a part of international moves to try and deal with this very, very serious issue. So this, I guess, is comparable to the NATO issue in that it presents a very, very stark contrast between the two candidates from the perspective of countries like Germany, others in Europe, and indeed countries all over the world.
Huge agenda point in this election campaign, and immigration is also an issue that has the entire Europe divided. How do you think the US election outcome is going to influence Europe and Germany in this regard?
Well, Flora, I think that's a really interesting question, because this brings us also to another key point when we're talking about this whole issue of Europe and the US election. Europe really does have its own serious issues at the moment, and we see this very, very clearly in Germany. Fretting too much about what happens in Europe or in the US rather, would really be, I would say, foolish when it comes to a lot of European and the German government in particular, because this issue, immigration, shows the extent to which these problems are often in the countries themselves and not necessarily connected to others. So, for example, at the moment you have in Germany a far-right party, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, polling very, very strongly between 20% and 30%, depending on the region of Germany. And this is a party, by the way, whose policies, when you look at them, they would almost make Trump look moderate in some respects. This is a really far-right party with some serious nativist policies and passionate, virulent anti-immigration stance. Now, obviously, that would align itself with Trump, but this is an issue that is going to endure in a country like Germany and in countries such as France and other countries in Europe, regardless of what happens in the American election. So these parties, these movements, these far-right groups that are often, their positions on different issues vary, but the one that they tend to all align on is fierce opposition to immigration. And that is backed up in some respects by the fact that over the last decade there has been a major increase in immigration to Europe from other parts of the world. And again, that's not necessarily going to change depending on what happens in the White House. But what I would say it will do is, if Trump were to win, we know how much Trump's campaign has been driven by hatred of immigrants, dismissing the plight of some of those who are trying to cross into the United States from the southern border, using demonizing language. We saw that ridiculous moment in the debate when he talked about they're eating the cats and the dogs, referring to, these conspiracy theories online regarding immigrants in a town in Ohio. So we know the type of language he uses. If he was to win, having spoken like that throughout the campaign, then it obviously gives succor and support to those who share similar views in Europe. Harris is also somewhat, strong lately in terms of how she speaks on the issue of illegal immigration. Of course, uses much less demonizing and much less insulting and in some cases outrageous language than Trump. If Harris were to win, then I guess it does somewhat give more support to those who hold a more moderate view of how to deal with some of the challenges that are brought by immigration within Europe. But I think the bottom line here is that regardless of what happens, we are not going to see a change in the situation in Europe with regard to this issue.
Right. We'll circle back a little bit, Arthur, when you mentioned about the far right, and you mentioned that it's a three-way coalition government in Germany right now. How do you see it impacting your government internally?
Well, I think, as I said at the outset, a Trump victory would present something of a crisis is maybe going too far, because, 4 years ago, whenever it was, 8 years ago rather, when he was first elected, there was also a lot of sort of terror expressed in the first few days and weeks. But life goes on, people adjust to it, and while it brings, of course, serious challenges, there's not necessarily the same panic afterwards as there is beforehand. So life will obviously go on if Trump is to win, and diplomatic relations will continue. But there has been a sense that if Trump were to win, it would probably prolong the life of this three-way coalition, because they would probably not want to be seen to be dealing with their own internal wrangling at a time when Europe has to galvanise in support of Ukraine and generally galvanise in support of the transatlantic alliance in the face of a Trump presidency. If Harris were to win, well, that would be certainly seen as a continuation of Biden, a continuation of the status quo, a potentially more stable situation for transatlantic relations, and that may therefore mean that the German government may feel, well, not that they feel it necessarily, but that it's easier for the kind of tensions that are clearly apparent within that three-way coalition. It would be easier for them to simply come to the surface, and that government would fall, and that there would be a new election. But ultimately, from this German government's perspective, from the next German government's perspective, let's say, if that is to, comprise of the main opposition, the CDU, the centre-right CDU party. Either way, I think they want the transatlantic relationship to be strong, to be maintained, support for NATO to be maintained, for no major tariffs to be imposed, for no new trade war. We heard from Christian Lindner there, the finance minister of Germany, talking about that issue. So I think that's the bottom line for whoever's in power in Germany, is that they do not want this disruption and uncertainty that the first Trump presidency brought, and that clearly all would point to them hoping for a Harris victory.
Absolutely. Arthur, before I let you go, regardless of the outcome of the 60th US presidential elections, what do you think are the key priorities for Germany, irrespective of who sits at the Oval Office?
Well, at the moment in Germany does have a pretty under-functioning, stagnant economy. For 3 years, the German economy really hasn't grown. It has struggled to emerge from the COVID crisis. A lot of the issues related, for example, to the war, that led to serious problems for the German economy because of its previous reliance on Russian oil and gas. The change in relationship with China, obviously, as Europe and the US indeed has taken a more hawkish stance on China. Germany has traditionally relied on China as a major market for its exports. That as well has fundamentally undermined Germany's economic model. So the last thing really Germany would need right now is a trade war, or certainly an increase in tariffs from the US. That's a really big issue for Germany because of the fact the economy has been doing so poorly. But also Germany is the largest country in Europe. There is a sort of a consistent need or an expectation from some countries that Germany should take more of a leadership role when it comes to important international issues, whether that's war in Ukraine or the Middle East or whatever the issue may be. Germany, because of its history with the Nazis and with World War II, is reluctant to take on that type of a role. It's been consistently shown for decades. Germany doesn't necessarily want to take on that role, even if it's expected to do so. And it does not want to have to be thrust into that position in the event of a Trump victory, at a time when its own domestic economy and indeed its own government seems to have so many problems. When Trump was previously in the White House, you had Angela Merkel in power, who was at that time seen as a very strong leader, someone who there was broad international sort of admiration of. Now that may have changed. Her legacy is obviously evolving as the years pass since she left office. But that was a time when it was probably easier for the German leader to take on that role. So I think that's a key point here. Germany does not want necessarily to be thrust into this important position in the event of a Trump victory, given its own serious problems economically and otherwise.
Absolutely. Thank you for speaking to us, Arthur. And tomorrow is voting day for one of the oldest democracies in the world, and United States of America will hopefully soon see a new president in the Oval Office. For all the live updates, for all analysis on the 2024 US presidential elections, please tune in to the official YouTube channel of the Indian Express. Thank you for watching us.
Kamala Harris! Donald Trump.